Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the story of a religion where sex was sacred, veils meant power, and the goddess demanded moans instead of hymns, from kings reenacting divine orgasms to guarantee a good harvest. Two priestesses anointed in oils before ceremonially sleeping with strangers in the name of cosmic balance. Two clay tablets that recorded every offering, every sigh, and every sacred thrust with the same precision used for grain taxes. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if slightly unhinged anthropology, ancient rituals, and uncomfortable truths are your idea of a good time. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Midnight in Cairo, dawn in Berlin, or hiding under the covers in Wisconsin. Now, ease into something soft, a dim room, maybe a cup of something warm. Let the glow of your screen be the temple flame, and together, let's step barefoot into the house of heaven. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not a king, not a queen, not even someone whose name history bothered to write down, but someone whose body was once considered a cosmic crossroad, where desire met divinity and flesh became ritual. You weren't born to wear a crown. You were born to carry a temple inside your skin. If your mother had whispered your name to the goddess Inanna instead of a local midwife, your life might have started with a vow, a quiet promise etched into clay and blood, that you would serve, not in silence, but in shimmer. You wouldn't be swaddled in wool, but maybe rubbed in fragrant oils, watched not by doting elders but by priestesses measuring your hips for ceremonial sashes. They'd look you over, not for signs of beauty, but of potential ecstasy divine, sanctioned, strategically allocated. Because in ancient Sumer, especially in places like Uruk or Babylon, being a temple woman wasn't scandal, it was sanctity. Well, until later, scholars started clutching their pearls. But we'll get there. For now, you're just a child. Not necessarily poor, not necessarily royal. Maybe your family owed a debt. Maybe your aunt was already in the temple, and your parents thought, why not? Maybe they believed the best place for a girl was close to the gods. Or maybe they didn't think much about it at all. Children were given to temples like offerings, some for bookkeeping, others for brewing beer, and some for more fragrant purposes, and so, you'd be handed over to the Temple of Inanna, also known as the House of Heaven. Grand name, tall gates, thick walls, and inside, a world ruled not by kings, but by calendars, incense, and rituals older than most of the cities we live in today. The temple wasn't all silk and seduction. You'd start with chores, sweeping courtyards, carrying offerings, learning to chant praises while balancing a jug on your head. You'd hear hymns so sweet they could make a god weep, and then recite them until your throat ached. You'd be taught not just to move, but to move like her Inanna, the goddess of love and war and everything in between. They'd show you how she danced when she conquered cities, how she tilted her head before seducing a king, how her glance could bring rain or ruin. No pressure. Over time, you'd learn the rules of being sacred. You'd learn that your body wasn't yours, but also not entirely anyone else's. It was ceremonial. It was a symbol. It was a tool, one that had to be perfumed, respected, disciplined, and occasionally lent to strangers wearing too much perfume and too little shame. But not yet. First, you'd learn to speak with your eyes, to stand very still, to listen without reacting when scribes argued about barley rations and hymns in the same breath. And slowly, you'd become part of the temple's breathing. You'd recognize the rhythms, the chant of the dawn, the hum of the evening sacrifice, the silence of political transactions, masked as divine pronouncements. You weren't a slave, but you weren't free. You were something else, a walking contradiction wrapped in linen and metaphor. And then, perhaps after years of learning how to make your voice sound like longing and your silence like invitation, you'd be initiated, not with fire, with touch. A ritual union, not random, not secret, not shameful. With a chosen man, perhaps a priest, perhaps a king, but never just a man. Because in that moment, he represented Dumuzi, the shepherd lover of Inanna. And you, of course, were the goddess. And that's where things begin to get strange. And strange it would remain. Because once you've crossed that threshold, once your body has become ritual, not rumory, stop being just a girl in the temple. You become part of the temple, not metaphorically, functionally, structurally. You are now a working component in what might have been the most bureaucratically sensual institution in the ancient world. See, People like to imagine temples as holy spaces where candles flicker and everyone whispers. But in Sumer, in Akkad, in Babylon, temples were more like metaphysical corporations. The house of heaven wasn't just a religious site, it was a city within the city. A palace, yes, but also a farm, a granary, a bank, a record office, and most uncomfortably for modern sensibilities a brothel, though that word never quite fits right. It's too blunt for something so calibrated. The temple didn't run on donations and incense. It ran on labor and grain. Contracts were signed. Debt was tracked. Rations distributed. Land leased. It had managers, scribes, and procurement officers. And all of it, every bushel of barley, every jar of oil, every sacred loincloth, was overseen in the name of Inanna. She was, in a way, both the CEO and the divine mascot. And then there was you, or rather, your new role. As someone consecrated to divine intimacy, you weren't tucked away in some dark room waiting for midnight rituals. You were part of the visible, economic, and ceremonial engine. Sometimes you danced in processions, sometimes you poured libations for aristocrats, hoping to bribe the divine through a generous wink. Sometimes you sat behind a veil, not in hiding, but in reverence, because that thin fabric wasn't about modesty. It was a reminder that you belonged to someone beyond flesh. Pilgrims would come, some with prayers, others with coins. And the coins, they weren't payment for you. Not directly. They were offerings. To the temple, to the goddess. You were just the mediator, the living altar. And still, there were ledgers. That's the part people forget. That even in the realm of sacred ecstasy, someone was writing things down. Clay tablets, noting names, dates, quantities. This man donated a lamb, that one offered silver. This woman sang a lamentation song so beautiful 3 scribes forgot their ink. Every divine moment was cross-referenced by someone with back pain and a stylus. There were feast days when you'd be paraded like royalty, and others when you'd wash blood off the altar floor because a goat got nervous during the sacrifice. There were nights you were summoned to bless visiting dignitaries with divine hospitality, and mornings you listened to the high priestess argue over whether the temple bakery was shorting its sesame rations again. And through it all, the temple pulsed not as a sanctuary, but as a system. Sacred and profane, sensual and strategic, chaotic and ruthlessly organized, and you drenched in perfume, bound by linen, consecrated by rite work, expected to keep moving through it all like a star in orbit, perfect, predictable, burning quietly while others navigated by your light. Because this wasn't just any temple, this was hers. Inanna didn't whisper, she roared. She didn't wait patiently on a pedestal for prayers. She stormed into myths, swinging doors off their hinges and demanding to be adored properly. And you didn't just serve her, you became her. For an hour, a night, a moment. And the city, all dusty and dignified, knew it. If you had walked through Uruk's wide streets during the festival of Inanna, you'd have seen it. The transformation. The city didn't just celebrate her, it trembled for her. She wasn't some delicate fertility figure holding a flower. She was love and war in one bronze-girded body, the goddess of paradoxes, of tangled sheets and blood-slick spears, of beauty so radiant it could end dynasties, and fury so precise it could set the Tigres on fire. Her hymns were not gentle. They praised her thighs, her lips, her moans, her terrifying ecstatic hunger. They described her taking Dumuzi, her shepherd consort with a dominance that could humble thunder. She was the one who makes the heavens tremble, the one who shakes the hips that sway the cosmos. And this was your model of holiness. So, you learned to arch your eyebrow like a threat and a blessing, to speak in tones that made old men remember youth and young kings forget treaties, to carry desire the way a warrior carries a blade not for pleasure, but for power. Inanna was the goddess of boundaries crossed. She was the only deity to descend into the underworld, naked and alone, and return. She was rage and renewal. She destroyed cities for offenses like not recognizing her magnificence. That was the job description, which meant that you vowed, perfumed, and trained in the art of divine invitation were not submissive. You were dangerous. You weren't seducing men. You were embodying a cosmic force, and the men knew it. Even kings knew it, especially the kings, because before a man could rule Sumer, he had to first pass through her hands. Not all temple women were you. Some lit incense, some poured beer, some sang laments so raw they made the gods homesick, and some, well, They filed tablets, swept courtyards, and muttered curses at donkeys. It was a full-service operation, after all. But if you were chosen, trained, veiled, just so you might have become a Kedistu, a holy one. That's what the scribes called you. Anyway, though it's a term scholars still trip over. Some say it meant sacred prostitute, others say priestess, others argue both or neither. Translation gets slippery when you're dealing with goddesses who turn lovers into snakes and temples where sex is scripture. But what's clear is this: there was a hierarchy. At the top, the N2, the high priestess, usually of royal blood, always terrifying. She didn't just preside over the rituals, she was the ritual, especially the Hyros, Gamos, the sacred marriage. When planting season loomed and the land cried out for fertility, it was her job to join with the king in ceremonial union, reenacting Inanna's coupling with Dumuzi. This wasn't an orgy, it was a policy decision, a state act performed in full view of the heavens and, occasionally, the upper crust of the city's priestly class. The crops, the rains, the fate of barley futures hinged on how convincingly the goddess and her consort moaned. And under the Intu, a network of temple servants, the Nadru women, often cloistered, often celibate, living in temple quarters like administrators of the divine. They might never lie with a man, but they controlled grain, wrote contracts, and brokered sacred deals with a flick of the stylus. Then came others. Ishtarichu Haremtu terms that float through the tablets like smoke, hard to grasp. Some sang, some wept. Some, like you, might be trained to consecrate a body with your own. You weren't a sex worker, not really. You were a translator, of longing, of the gods, of the thunder behind beauty. And somewhere in this strange ecosystem moved the gala priestsmen who spoke in falsetto, wore women's clothes, and channeled Inanna through lament and ecstasy. Gender, like everything else in her temple, was not a rule but a suggestion. No matter your title, your rank, or your veiling, one thing was true: you were part of a ritual labor force, unlike anything in the modern world. You weren't serving lust, you were maintaining a cosmology. Because to keep the world spinning, someone had to lie down, preferably on clean linen, with a priest humming nearby, while the moon watched politely. See, in Sumer, sex wasn't personal. It was agricultural, political, meteorological. It was the string holding the whole shaky cosmos together. And when the time came to reinforce that string, to remind the gods that humans were still cooperating, the temple prepared for the sacred marriage. The Hyros. It sounds romantic, until you realize it was less moonlit tryst and more state-sponsored fertility broadcast, a rite performed not behind closed doors, but in ceremonial chambers, or sometimes rooftops decked in palm fronds and carved lions, while elders muttered blessings and scribes stood by with tablets, presumably not taking notes on performance. At the center, the king, not a warrior here, not a lawgiver, just a man with nervous sweat and something to prove. And you're perhaps the high priestess embodying Inanna in her most generative form. But this wasn't just sex, it was the act of world-keeping, the reenactment of divine union between Inanna and Dumuzi, the goddess and her lover, the heavens and the earth. Done correctly, it guaranteed rains, harvests, political stability, and general cosmic decency for another year. Done poorly, well, no one liked to talk about that. And yes, people knew what was happening. The city didn't blush. They gathered in plazas, lit lamps, sang hymns like the one where Inanna boasts, "Plough my vulva, man of my heart," which, frankly, lacks subtlety but gets the job done. The ritual was layered. There were offerings, speeches, scented oils, the symbolic pouring of water, and scattering of seed. A choreographed choreography of divine foreplay. Every touch was metaphor, every breath an invocation. The act wasn't supposed to feel good. It was supposed to mean good, for the fields, for the flocks, for the royal treasury, and afterward, feasting processions. The king would emerge flushed with divine favor, while you were expected to look like someone who just single-handedly prevented a drought. This was the burden of cosmic maintenance. And if you think that sounds exhausting, wait until we talk about the economics of sacred desire. Because while the gods were allegedly watching, so was everyone else. That's the bit they don't inscribe in gold. How sacred sex wasn't just whispered ritual or hidden mysticism. It was public, performative, pinned under the eyes of 1,000 onlookers who all had an opinion on whether your veil was too sheer or your hips swayed too much during the barley blessing. You became a symbol, yes, but also a spectacle. And it's a fine line between reverence and scrutiny. When you're the one draped in crimson and myrrh, while the high priest chants blessings over your body like it's a sacred text, people stared. Men tried not to. Women pretended not to. Children giggled. And somewhere in the crowd, a merchant made a joke that would get him slapped if his wife had heard it. But you were trained for this, to walk with your gaze level, to smile without warmth, to exude divinity and also unapproachability, because while you were sacred, you were not available. You were for the goddess, and maybe on appointed feast days, in sanctioned ceremonies, at the right lunar alignment for someone chosen by her priests. There were processions. Oh, the processions. You'd be anointed, adorned, and paraded through the city's dusty arteries like a breathing banner of divine favor. Your body painted in saffron, lips stained with wine and pomegranate. You moved to drums that echoed off mud-brick temples, past crowds tossing petals and sometimes propositions. There was always that one noble son who winked too slowly. But what they didn't see was the chanting, the veils, the incense hid-wise the cost. You had no privacy. Your sanctity was a public utility. Every gesture became evidence, every sigh a possible omen. One wrong expression and rumors bloomed like mold on old dates. Had you smiled too warmly at a scribe? Was your ankle exposed for a moment too long? Had your voice trembled in the middle of a hymn? You learned quickly to guard yourself with ritual, because the city might worship you today and whisper tomorrow that you were just a glorified courtesan. And the line between reverence and ruin, it was written in cuneiform by men who didn't know what your job truly entailed. Let's talk about grain, because behind the fragrance, behind the hymns, behind the celestial choreography of hips and harvests there were ledgers, always ledgers. If you had become a sacred servant of Inanna, your body may have channeled the divine, but your worth was still tallied in silver shekels and goat counts. Economics didn't stop at the temple door. It sat inside, cross-legged, counting jars of oil and muttering about barley prices, while sacred women like you kept the whole divine PR machine running. Temples were rich, filthy rich, not just in gold, but in land, cattle, and contracts. They were landlords, lenders, exporters, employers. They collected taxes and sometimes issued them. Farmers paid tithes not to a king, but to the goddess Fire. You merchants made donations, not entirely out of piety, but because favorable trade winds might follow a well-timed offering. And of course, pilgrims came. Some walked for weeks, bringing honey, dates, or whatever passed for a decent bribe in their region. And yes, some of them offered coin in exchange for something less metaphorical. But here's where it gets slippery. What modern ears hear as prostitution was, in Sumerian terms, divine hospitality. You weren't selling yourself, you were participating in a ritual economy. The silver they left behind wasn't for you, it was temple revenue. You got none of it, well, maybe some soap and sesame cakes, but not enough to buy your own freedom. You were sacred, not salaried. Your body was considered a blessing, their payment, an offering, the transaction, disguised in incense and theology, and the scribes wrote it all down. Pilgrim from Sippar, 1 lamb, 2 shekels, offered to the goddess via Kadist or Lilatu, whether favorable, no complaints. You were a line item on a balance sheet, written in clay, a variable in a divine accounting system where desire was taxed, sanctified, and redistributed. Meanwhile, the temple fed hundreds. It housed orphans, it lent grain, it built irrigation canals and sometimes entire neighborhoods, all funded by celestial commerce, where you were both priestess and product. And when the temple needed more silver, the rituals expanded. More festivals, more processions, more sacred unions. After all, Inanna was a goddess of love, and love, in this city, had overhead, but not everyone in the temple looked like you. Shall we meet the ones who bent more than just bodies, and blurred the lines of gender long before anyone had a word for it? Then let me introduce you to the gala priests. If you'd walked through the courtyards of Inanna's temple, feet dusted in ash, ears full of hymn, you might have heard a voice that didn't match the body it came from, high-pitched, haunting, singing laments in a language reserved for mourning gods and raising the dead. That voice likely belonged to a gala, and he or she or they were part of the divine chorus long before pronouns became a battleground. You see, Inanna didn't just rule love and war, she ruled thresholds. She governed doorways, transitions, paradoxes. She blurred binaries for fun. It made perfect sense that her most devoted priests embodied that same divine ambiguity. The Gala were often assigned male at birth, but many wore women's clothing, styled their hair like priestesses, spoke in the MSL dialect, traditionally reserved for female voices, and sometimes adopted feminine names. Their role wasn't just performance, it was embodiment. They lamented with a sorrow so potent it was said to awaken divine mercy, and when they chanted over a body, the gods listened. But lamentation was only part of it. Some Gala were involved in sacred sexual rites, others in divination. Some served as intermediaries between temple and public, bridging not just gender but class, language, ritual, and grief. They moved through the temple like shadows with purpose always slightly outside of what society understood, and yet absolutely central to how the temple functioned. Were they eunuchs? Were they queer? That word doesn't quite fit, but it hovers close. What's certain is that their existence unsettled later empires. The Greeks were baffled, the Romans rolled their eyes, and the biblical scribes, well, let's just say they had notes. But in Sumer no one flinched, because Inanna herself once cast off her clothes, gender, and symbols of power to descend into the underworld, and she returned, changed, more powerful, more terrifying, more herself. So the Gala weren't anomalies, they were holy. Their very bodies disrupted expectations, just like the goddess who claimed them. And if they confused you, good. That meant they were doing their job. You, watching from behind your veil, might have admired them, or envied them, or feared them just a little. Because while the public celebrated ritual, the boundaries it pushed often made even the faithful uncomfortable, especially when sex, ambiguity, and the divine collided. And that discomfort, while it had consequences, because centuries long after the hymns had faded and the incense had turned to dust, a different kind of priest walked into the ruins and said this must have been a brothel. That's how the story got twisted. Not by accident, by design. The Greeks arrived first, curious, half-jealous, utterly scandalized. Herodotus, wide-eyed and morally baffled, scribbled down a tale that every woman in Babylon had to offer herself at least once to a stranger in the temple of Ishtar, a ritual of enforced sacred sex. He clucked disapprovingly, misunderstood everything, and passed it off as fact. Later, Roman historians piled on, and then the monotheists, Hebrew scribes, Christian monks, Islamic chroniclers, each recoiling harder than the last. Sacred sexuality didn't fit their moral software, so they recoded it, erased the rituals, rewrote the roles, and replaced Inanna with a cautionary tale. What was once Kadistu, Holy One, became whore. They stripped her name of its sanctity, turned the divine marriage into perversion, labeled the Gala priests as abominations. The temple became a den of sin. Never mind the tablets, never mind the hymns, never mind that the sacred rites kept cities fed, kings crowned, and myths alive. If it involved sex, and women had power in it, it had to be dirty. Centuries of scholarship followed the same path. Victorian archaeologists found figurines of naked women with open palms and labeled them cult prostitutes. Because of course they did. When all you have is a monocle and a Puritan hangover, everything looks like depravity. But modern scholars slowly, carefully began brushing off the layers. Literally and metaphorically, they reread the Sumerian, retranslated the Akkadian, re-examined the records, and what they found was nuance. There was no evidence of temple prostitution as imagined by the Greeks, no lines of women forced to wait for strangers, no compulsory rites of sexual humiliation. What did exist was something far more complex, fanned, far more threatening to simple narratives. A culture where sex could be sacred, where ritual intimacy could be divine, where the body wasn't shameful, but scripted with meaning. Of course, that's harder to put in a textbook. The priestess was not a prostitute, but a ritual specialist in a complex cultic economy rooted in Mesopotamian cosmology. Doesn't sell as many scandalous museum pamphlets. So the myth of sacred prostitution stuck because it's easier to gawk than to understand, easier to judge than to translate, and easier, always, to forget what makes us uncomfortable. But forgetting comes with a cost, because the goddess didn't fall. She was pushed. When empires shifted and theologies hardened, Inanna, who once ruled love, war, weather, and the human pelvis, became inconvenient. You can't run a patriarchal priesthood when the most powerful deity in town is a boundary-smashing sex goddess who wears lions as accessories and turns kings into trembling consorts. So she was rebranded. First, the Akkadians softened her into Ishtar, still wild, still glorious but more state-friendly. Then the Babylonians began to clamp down. By the time the Assyrians carved her into stone, she looked more like a goddess of war with a side hustle in love. The sensuality remained, but it was weaponized. Beautiful, yes, but also bloody. A warning, not a blessing. And then came monotheism. Yahweh didn't leave room for rulers. The gods of Sumer were cast as idols, their worship condemned, their rituals erased, or reinterpreted as degeneracy. Inanna, once the queen of heaven, was either ignored completely or filtered through the lens of demonology, imagined as Lilith, the seductress, the child snatcher, the woman who said no and was never forgiven. Her temples were abandoned, her priestesses forgotten, her rites unspoken. The sacred sex that once maintained the cosmos became taboo. Women's bodies were now sinful, not symbolic. Sexuality became property of the husband, not the goddess. And the temple which once sang with hymns praising vulvas as vessels of creation was replaced by silence, or worse, by accusations. You, if you had served her then, would have watched the veils darken, rituals shortened, ranks closed, the Cadisto dismissed, the gala priests mocked, exiled, or worse. The offerings stopped coming, the doors stopped opening. Eventually, the incense burned out, the tablets were buried, the hymns were forgotten. And when archaeologists stumbled upon the ruins millennia later, they didn't hear echoes of sacred songs or political theater or ecstatic prayer. They just saw the dust and called it a brothel. What once shimmered with the sweat of divinity faded into historical footnotes, translated poorly and misunderstood deliberately. But not all was lost, because if you strain your ears, lean close to the tablets, if you read, not just the lines, but the pauses between them, you can still hear her. The goddess who demanded worship not through fear, but through pleasure. The priestesses who walked without shame. The voices who once said, "This body is holy, and so is what I do with it." And now, all that's left are fragments, tablets, mostly, clay ones, inscribed by hands that have long since turned to dust. Some are prayers, coiled in divine longing. Others are receipts, blunt and transactional. 1 lamb, 2 jugs of oil, offering to Inanna via temple. Somewhere between poetry and inventory lies the outline of your life, the life you could have had. We find you in bits, in broken hymns that still praise your shining vulva with alarming sincerity, in administrative records that list your name beside quantities of grain, or beer, or perfume, your contribution to the temple ledger neatly itemized, in figurines of women, bare-chested arms at their sides, faces calm, not pornographic, but present, still, a little defiant. We find your world in the ruins of Uruk, where the temple of inner house of heaven rises like a scar from the dirt. Its foundations once supported rituals so powerful they claimed to tilt the stars. Now, it supports weeds, and the occasional archaeologist with a sunburn and a soft brush, squinting into history's underbelly. And sometimes, we find you in the words of the goddess herself, or rather, words others wrote for her, pretending she was dictating. Who will plow my wet fields? Who will kiss my mouth, full of honey? It's still there, in Akkadian syllables scratched 1,000 times, like someone was afraid the world would forget what passion sounded like. It nearly did, but you echo through it all. Not as a sinner, not as a victim, but as someone whose skin once carried stories bigger than herself, someone whose rituals shaped empires, whose silence was enforced by time, not choice. Your name might be gone, or it might be hiding in museum storage under a catalog number no one's translated in decades. You could be a footnote in a doctoral thesis, a question mark in a curated display case, or you might be a hymn waiting to be reread correctly. Because even when temples crumble and gods fall out of fashion, the memory of touch this sacred kind lingers. It stains the walls, it curls into the clay, it sings, quietly, to those willing to listen. Then here we are, standing in the ruins, and misremembering everything, because the body once clothed in gold-threaded linen, and anointed with oil drawn from crushed lilies, is now reconstructed through museum glass and academic hesitation. The sacred became scandal, and the scandal became marketable. The story of the divine courtesan is too juicy to ignore, too complex to honor, and too inconvenient to explain at length in a gift shop. So what do? We simplify, we flatten, we misname. Tour guides talk about fertility figurines with awkward chuckles, skipping the part where those figurines might have represented not some abstract symbol of reproduction, but a person who danced in processions, sang to the goddess, and once held a king's gaze with nothing but a tilt of your head. They show schoolchildren temple carvings of nude women and call them artifacts of ancient vice, when what they're really showing are relics of cosmic alignment, inscriptions of balance, echoes of rites meant to maintain not just crops, but the sacred equilibrium between human longing and divine order. Your memory has been managed, curated, erased, rewritten, monetized. Inanna survives, but she's fragmented. Aphrodite inherited her curves but not her rage. Mary borrowed her titles but scrubbed out her sexuality. Lilith took her independence and was cast as a demon for the trouble, the sacred prostitute. She was flattened into a footnote, then into a punchline, and you were never given a fair translation, but you're still here, in the cuneiform syllables that never learned how to lie, in the clay statues with their unashamed posture, in the myths that refused to be entirely erased, even after millennia of moral revision. You are not forgotten. You are and misremembering is a subtler violence than erasure. It lets us look at what was sacred and call it obscene. It lets us walk through ancient temples and feel nothing but curiosity, when reverence complicated, uncomfortable reverence might be more appropriate. It lets us keep pretending that divinity was always clothed in silence, instead of sweat, and maybe that's the final act of the goddess, not to be believed in, but to be misunderstood so thoroughly that she becomes impossible to erase. Because the truth is, you were never just the servant of a goddess. You were her echo, her ritual, her reminder, and history, in all its tidy little boxes, still doesn't quite know what to do with you. The heat of the southern sun had barely warmed the carved stones when the procession began. A small girl, draped in silk far too rich for her size, stood beside a garlanded priest with oil on his fingers and mantras on his breath. She had no idea that this moment would define the rest of her life, not in the sentimental way, but in the literal, binding, ritualistic sense. She was not being initiated into a school or welcomed into a club. She was being wed, not to a man, of course, but to a god who hadn't blinked in 1,000 years. This wasn't rare. In Tamil Nadu, under Karnataka, families sometimes offered their daughters to the temple as acts of supreme devotion, or, less poetically, as part of long-standing family obligation, local prestige, karmic negotiation, or sheer economic desperation. In theory, this child was now a Nitya Sumangali, a woman forever auspicious, eternally married, immune to widowhood by virtue of being bound to an immortal. No more dowry to pay, no husband's death to mourn, just the quiet permanence of divine attachment. The ritual itself was precise, layered with symbolism and flower petals. The girl's hair would be oiled and braided, her forehead marked with vermilion, her toes painted, her wrists heavy with bangles that didn't quite fit. She would be led to the sanctum, where the deity, usually Shiva or Vishnu, waited behind thick, perfumed darkness. A thread might be tied round her neck, mimicking a wedding chain. She might even receive a symbolic name, something holy and elaborate, befitting a wife of the divine. But beneath all this ceremony was a much stranger kind of transformation. She no longer belonged to her family in any conventional sense, nor did she quite belong to society. She had been lifted into a space that was simultaneously sacred and unprotected, elevated in theory, yet excluded in practice. Not a nun, not a wife, not quite a girl anymore, and certainly not a child anyone could safely pity. There was an unspoken rule: the moment she stepped out of the temple courtyard, the silks stopped shielding her. Her sanctity was conditional. It flickered under public scrutiny. It depended heavily on the continuity of ritual and the protection of a crumbling temple economy. She had been entrusted to God, yes, but gods are notoriously unreliable caretakers, especially when their priests control the finances and their altars are short on offerings. Still, within the temple walls, something began to grow, a discipline, a precision, a grace, because if devotion meant surrender, that surrender had to be choreographed, and so the girl began to move. The temple didn't just demand faith, it demanded rhythm. She was up before dawn, not for prayer exactly, but for posture. Ankles aligned, spine elongated, hands bent just so, like birds mid-flight or flames caught still. Her training was as physical as it was metaphysical. Precision wasn't a suggestion, it was survival. To dance for the gods was to invite them to inhabit you, and sloppy footwork was not the kind of possession anyone welcomed. The instructors, often older Didvadesis or sometimes male gurus with oil-soaked hair and no tolerance for mediocrity, taught more than just steps. They taught stamina wrapped in grace. Every gesture had a name, a history, a meaning layered thicker than the temple walls. The lifting of an eyebrow might symbolize desire or wrath. A flick of the wrist could summon rain or recount mythic betrayal. One misstep and you weren't just offbeat, you were disrespecting centuries of choreographed theology. The floor of the training hall was usually stone, sometimes wood if the temple was lucky, but either way it echoed. Each slap of the bare foot was a syllable. The dance was a text. Bharatanatyam, though it wasn't always called that, was less performance than it was invocation. Each sequence retold a story, enacted a cosmic balance, embodied a mood from the scriptures. But the irony hung there like incense. The girl herself didn't always understand what her body was saying, not at first. Still, repetition has a way of transforming confusion into instinct. Over time, the choreography seeped into her muscles. Movements that once felt foreign began to reside in her, not just as memory, but as identity. Her arms learned to curve like the river Ganga. Her eyes learned to mimic the slow descent of twilight. And her breath was no longer hers alone. It was paced to the rhythm of something older, deeper, and occasionally terrifying. There were moments, rare but unforgettable, when she would lose herself in the dance. Not dramatically, no collapsing in ecstasy, no whispered declarations, just a shift, a disappearance. The temple pillars would blur, the drumbeat would dissolve, and she would feel something pass through her, or perhaps rise up from within like a tide that didn't ask permission. This was what the training prepared her for, to become a conduit, a vessel, not of art, of presence. And presence, in these temples, came dressed in sensuality, because what the gods liked, apparently, was seduction. It's hard to say when exactly the dance turned erotic. It didn't arrive with fanfare or scandal. It was already there, nestled between the folds of the sari, encoded in the tilt of a hip or the arch of an eyebrow. The temple didn't separate beauty from devotion, or desire from discipline. Why would it? The gods themselves didn't. Krishna was flirtatious. Shiva danced until the universe burned. The feminine divine wasn't chaste. She was ferocious, lush, and magnetic. So why should her servants be anything less? The erotic, in this world, was a form of worship, not a transgression but a technique. A way to draw divine attention, to stir the stillness of stone deities, with a body that moved like poetry in real time. The Devadasi wasn't trying to seduce men, at least, not primarily. She was trying to seduce God. And God, being God, noticed everything. To call it sacred prostitution, as later reformers would, was to miss the point by several lifetimes. The Devadasi wasn't selling herself. She had already been given. Her body was public only in the sense that it was ritualized, mythologized, and folded into a script older than any local gossip. Every motion of hers, the sway of her torso, the flutter of her fingers, carried metaphors from epics no one read anymore, but everyone felt. Pleasure wasn't the purpose. It was the method. Still, the line was thin. And sometimes, it blurred completely. Outside the sanctum, interpretations varied. A wealthy patron might see the dance as invitation. A jealous wife might see it as threat. A priest might see it as power he didn't control. The dance, once divine, could shift dangerously into spectacle. What was meant for gods could become currency among mortals, especially when the gods stopped paying. But within the temple, during that narrow sliver of twilight, when lamps were lit and the air turned gold, the old meanings still clung to the walls. The dance was still a language, the body still a script, and the woman in motion, adorned, barefoot, unreadable, was still believed to be, in that moment, inhabited. And if the divine had indeed taken up residence in her, then she needed to be protected, or, failing that, maintained. And for that, she would need something very human, patrons. Power in the temple didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore anklets. The Devadasi, despite her ambiguous position, wasn't powerless, not at first. She occupied a role both exalted and precarious, like a dancer balanced mid-turn, graceful only so long as the rhythm held. She had access to the inner sanctum when others didn't. She performed rituals the priests themselves would not, and she was, for a time, indispensable. But devotion doesn't feed you. Influence did. The temple system thrived on patronage, kings, landlords, merchants, even village elders who fancied themselves pious. A successful Devadasi could attract support from powerful men who saw in her both spiritual value and social ornament. She might be granted land, servants, silks, jewelry. She might commission music, sponsor renovations, or train a small lineage of disciples. In some cases, her wealth rivaled that of the priests. She could read, write, compose. She held ceremonial authority. She was not, by any means, a passive ornament. Yet her power was always mediated through relationship with the god. Yes, but more pressingly, with those who funded the god's household. The temple needed gold. The gods didn't mint their own coins, so the dancer became the intermediary between sacredness and economics, a role that brought prestige but never quite protection, because patronage is fickle. Empires collapse, kings die, new moralities arrive, draped in missionary coats and carrying pamphlets, and what had once been revered as ritual suddenly starts to look suspiciously like pleasure, or worse, independence. Still, in her prime, the Devadasi wasn't a victim. She was a cultural node, a conduit of memory, a keeper of the unbroken thread between myth and motion. Her songs were archival. Her body held stories older than the language they were written in. She knew how to wield a glance like a blade, and how to command a room with silence. But society has a particular suspicion of women who need neither husband nor veil. An independence, once tolerated in temples, began to look more and more like a problem in the street. And so the paradox set in. She who had been wedded to divinity found herself slowly divorced from respectability. It's a cruel kind of irony, really, to be sacred but not respectable, to be married to a god but avoided at festivals, to hold ritual authority but remain uninvited to the weddings of women who once watched you dance. The Devadasi existed in a social limbo, exalted and excluded, powerful and precarious, celebrated and shunned, while she was considered Nitya forever auspicious, beyond widowhood, above earthly loss. She was also forbidden the ordinary markers of womanhood: no husband, no married life, no children by the usual route. Society had looped her into a separate caste, one foot in the divine and the other firmly in suspicion. Her sexuality was both institutionalized and invisible. It was expected that she would have lovers, often the patrons who supported her art and livelihood. But these relationships had no formal recognition. They were intimate yet unacknowledged, contractual yet without contract. And because she couldn't marry, any child she bore was, technically, born into ambiguity. Even when raised with care, education, and pride, the child carried a whisper of impropriety that no amount of incense could mask. The social contract was clear. She could be admired, but not touched, unless it was in secrecy. She could be imitated on stage, but not befriended in daylight. She was tradition embodied, and scandal incarnate, a living contradiction, an ornament for the gods, but a warning for daughters. And then there was the slow erosion, not dramatic, not sudden, just the quiet fading of support. Temples once overflowing with gold and ghee began to rust. The royal lineages that sponsored the rituals thinned into politicians and industrialists with less taste for ritual dance and more for railroads. The Brahmins who once praised the Devadasi's sacred role now debated her usefulness, her morality, her place. It wasn't just society that turned, it was the economy. The patrons stopped arriving, the invitations dwindled. The child born into silks now begged to enroll in a school that would accept her name. And so, the dance that had once commanded divine attention found itself reinterpreted, not as ritual, not as art, but as something embarrassingly unmodern, something to be reformed or erased. The British arrived, as they often did, with ships, ledgers, and a deep conviction that they understood things better than the people who lived there. Temples, in their view, were exotic backdrops for decay and idolatry, and the Devadasi, she was a scandal waiting to be legislated. Victorian sensibility, already allergic to overt sensuality, saw in the temple dancer not a custodian of sacred heritage, but a woman too comfortable in her own skin. The entire structure of ritual eroticism, so integral to Indian temple life, was flattened into one word: prostitution. Never mind that the Devadasi performed for gods, not men. Never mind that her dance encoded cosmology, not titillation. To the British eye, she was a symbol of moral rot, and worse, female agency. And so, in came the missionaries with their pamphlets and sermons, offering salvation in exchange for silence. They spoke of rescue, of reform, of lifting the dancer from degradation, without ever asking her if she felt degraded. The Devadasi didn't need pity, she needed context. But context requires curiosity, and the colonial eye had none. It preferred labels to listening. Some Indian reformers, eager to prove their modern credentials, joined the campaign. They too began to see the Devada system as a blemish on the national soul, something pre-modern, something shameful, something to be purged in the cleansing fire of progress. The fact that many Devadasis were literate, skilled, artistically trained, and often financially independent. Inconvenient details. Reform rarely bothers with nuance. The temples, stripped of royal patronage, began to wither. The dances stopped, not because they were no longer meaningful, but because the audience had changed. Laws followed, banning dedication ceremonies, criminalizing what had once been sacred offerings. What had survived plagues, invasions, and dynastic collapse could not survive the polite horror of colonial morality. In public discourse, the Devadasi became a ghost, referenced, debated, condemned, but never heard. Her voice, once carried in song and gesture, now faded into the margin of policy documents and missionary reports. And with her silence came the silence of the gods. They remained on their pedestals, blind and mute, their favorite dancers vanishing one by one. By the time the last ceremonial thread was tied, it wasn't to a deity, it was to bureaucracy. The dedication of girls to temples had become illegal. Not immoral, not unwise, illegal. The very act that once elevated a child into ritual significance was now a criminal offense. It happened quietly, through the Devadasi abolition acts, wrapped in the rhetoric of protection and uplift. Few disagreed publicly. It was, after all, progress. But progress, like ritual, often forgets who's left behind. Without the temple, without the sacred, without even the ambiguous dignity of a recognized role, many former Devadasis found themselves nowhere in particular. The rituals that once framed their lives were gone. Their art, so intimately tied to worship, couldn't quite survive in a world that no longer believed in gods who danced. Some migrated to urban theaters, reshaping their craft for secular eyes. Bharatanatyam, once inseparable from divine service, was repackaged as respectable art. Costumes remained. Mudras remained, even the mythological stories remained. But the sacredness was stripped, sanitized, reconstructed for drawing rooms and auditoriums, mostly by Brahmin reformers who had once scorned the very women they now imitated. Irony followed, as it often does. The dance that had once been too impure for polite society was now performed in state-sponsored festivals. The women who had kept the tradition alive for centuries, not invited. Their lineage was erased, or, worse, absorbed into a new narrative, one that celebrated the revival of Indian classical arts, while quietly stepping over the bodies of those who had carried it in their blood. Others, those without connections or patrons or stage access, slipped into obscurity, or poverty, or sex work. It's not poetic, but it's true. Ritual once gave structure. Its absence left vacuum. A body trained to communicate ecstasy and divinity suddenly became a body for sale. Not because it wanted to, because no one wanted what it once offered. Meanwhile, temple corridors gathered dust. The gods sat adorned in fading garlands, their daily dances reduced to memory. Somewhere, a bell still rang at sunset. Somewhere, an anklet still jingled. But the woman it once belonged to had no reason to enter the sanctum anymore, because the doors, quite literally, had closed. What survives is quieter than it once was. No processions, no lavish ceremonies, no girls in garlands being offered to gods older than the language of their prayers. What remains lives mostly in echo, in the disciplined hands of dancers trained in studios far from temples, in dusty records tucked inside archives no one funds, and in the fading memories of women who were told, once, that they were divine. The classical arts, reborn for modern India, still carry fragments of the Devadasi world, but you'd have to squint. The poses remain, the stories remain. The footwork, the hand gestures, the emotional arcs, all intact. But the context has been polished away, filed down to fit the expectations of an audience that prefers reverence without the discomfort of history. Dance academies cite ancient treatises and clean lineages. Few mention the temple wives whose hips memorized the rhythm before textbooks did. Some descendants still live in the shadow of the temple walls, literally. Entire communities in Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, largely women, still carry the Devadasi label, not as honor, but as stigma. They are neither remembered as artists nor recognized as victims. Their status is legal fiction now, their reality shaped by generations of social ambiguity, no longer sacred, still not free. And the gods, they're still there, stone-faced, lotus-eyed, surrounded by rituals, stripped of their oldest companions. Modern priests perform ceremonies that once required the dance. Now the offering is still, silent, convenient, but not all traces vanish so easily. In the way Bharatanatyam dips into erotic stillness, in the sudden flicker of a dancer's eye during a mythic reenactment, in the hush that falls when the mirangam begins its pulse, you can feel it, the presence of someone else, someone who used to be central, someone who once believed that surrender wasn't a failure, but a form of knowledge. Sometimes, late at night, in empty temple courtyards, where jasmine has fallen and no devotees remain, you might hear it, the distant shimmer of ankle bells, not haunting, not mournful, just present, as if she never really left. It never begins with ceremony. It begins with sweat, with fevers that don't respond to herbs, with the sound of invisible footsteps circling a mat at night. The neighbors hear nothing, of course, but the girl hears everything, rattles without hands, whispers that come from the roof beam, a name that doesn't belong to anyone living. In the coastal temples of Benin, this is not cause for alarm, it's recognition. When a girl begins to speak in tongues she never learned, when her body moves to rhythms she's never been taught, the elders don't reach for chains, they call the priest. The god has chosen a wife, and the god is impatient. Vodun deities don't send roses. They come in tremors, in madness, in dreams so thick with serpent coils and white cloth that the waking world seems grey in comparison. Some girls resist. They run, hide, deny. But denial only prolongs the haunting. The god follows her into sleep, presses against her spine, refuses to be forgotten. Eventually, someone always leads her to the shrine, often an ant, occasionally a stranger. Once, a crow that refused to stop tapping at the window. The temple isn't a palace, it's a mouth. Once you step inside, it swallows you whole and begins rearranging your breath. The girl is stripped of her old name, her old clothes, her old kinship ties. For the duration of her initiation, she is no longer anyone's daughter. Not really. She belongs to the one who called her, the one whose altar drips with rum and eggshells, the one whose symbols are drawn in chalk that never seems to smudge. There are rites, of course. Long nights of possession, days of isolation, baths laced with herbs and oils that sting. Silence is mandatory. So is obedience. If she cries, no one intervenes. If she laughs at nothing, that's taken as a good sign. Spirits like laughter, it means the mind is loosening. The body, too. Sometimes, during the 7th or 8th day, she begins to shake, not out of fear, out of arrival. The god steps in. It's visible in the eyes, too wide, too deep, too old. She might dance, she might scream, she might speak in riddles, but one thing is certain, she won't remember all of it. The divine is possessive, and partial amnesia is a form of marking. From then on, she's no longer a girl with a future. She's a vessel with a tenant. And tenants, particularly divine ones, expect fidelity, which is where things get complicated. Because this isn't just marriage, it's conjugal, and gods, especially the hot-blooded ones, have very specific expectations after dark. The gods don't snore, they whisper, or hiss, or hum lullabies that no one remembers teaching them. And they don't take up space in the bed, they take up space in the bones. Nights, for a wife of the spirit, are rarely restful. Not when her dreams taste like honey and salt water. Not when invisible hands tug at her hips with the urgency of a jealous lover. Among the Vodun pantheon, some husbands are more affectionate than others. Dambola prefers water and calm. Mummy Water likes perfume, mirrors, and unblinking attention. Well, Legba likes things a little spicier. But what they all share is possessiveness, the kind that doesn't wait politely for offerings, the kind that arrives whether the priestess is ready or not. Sacred sexuality in this context isn't symbolic. It isn't metaphor. It shows up in the form of erotic trance, full-body shudders that look suspiciously like ecstasy, sighs that come from no known source of touch, and dreams that leave marks on the thighs. There's a reason temples keep cloths on hand for the morning, and not because of dew. The rituals are quiet, most of the time. A white cloth laid over the breasts, cowries whispered over the navel, beads strung not as decoration, but as boundary. This body belongs to someone unseen, but very much felt. Bathing becomes a ceremony, dressing a negotiation, and sexual abstinence, not from spirits, only from mortals. That's the rule. A divine wife is expected to keep her temple pure, meaning no husbands, no boyfriends, no flings behind the millet shed. The god sees everything, and takes betrayal very, very personally. There are stories, always whispered, never confirmed, of girls who broke their vows. One became mute. Another walked into the river and didn't come out. A third began to bleed from her palms whenever she tried to touch her lover. But there are benefits. The divine husband brings more than rules. He brings gifts, beauty, fertility, luck at markets, the ability to see things others can't. Sometimes he grants healing hands, sometimes just a knowing look that makes elders uncomfortable. And when the spirit is pleased, the whole village feels it. Rain comes on time, crops don't rot, the goats give twins. Still, love with the spirit is ... demanding. No cuddles, no anniversaries, just presence. Overwhelming, nightly presence. And the expectation that when the drums begin, even faintly, even far away, her hips will remember who they belong to. But the world outside the shrine doesn't always look kindly on this arrangement. It watches the divine wives with a strange mix of awe and suspicion, as if unsure whether to kneel or bolt. And that tension, that almost but not quite reverence, follows them through every market, every glance, every whispered joke disguised as flattery. She walks through the village wrapped in white, but people don't look at the cloth. They look at the space around her, the slight shimmer, the charged hush, the feeling that maybe the air gets warmer when she passes. Children step aside. Older women squint. Men, mostly, avert their gaze, unless they think she isn't looking. Being married to a god comes with prestige, yes, but not the comfortable kind. It's a type of status that isolates more than it elevates. She's not a wife in the way the others are. She doesn't cook for a husband or tend to a crying baby strapped to her back. Her intimacy is directed elsewhere, and it makes people nervous. At ceremonies, they sing her praises. They say she's blessed, touched, chosen. But at the market, someone always mumbles too loudly. That one talks to spirits. Or, don't let her touch your belly if you're pregnant. Or, in a low voice that pretends to be casual, she laughs too much at night. There's a line she walks, barefoot and daily, between the sacred and the suspect. On one side, the temple, the possession, the scent of camphor and rum. On the other, society, with its tidy categories and its general distaste for women who don't apologize for taking up space. The ambiguity is the point. She isn't supposed to be comfortable. Her role is to embody contradiction, purity and eroticism, submission and power, discipline and abandon. One moment, she's dancing with a bowl of fire on her head. The next, she's sitting silently by a shrine, translating the hum of the god into words that no one dares to write down. To some, she's a healer. To others, a threat. No one quite knows where she sleeps. Some say she doesn't. That spirits don't let their wives lie still for too long. Too much stillness, and they might start thinking for themselves. And yet, despite the discomfort she provokes, people still seek her out. For fertility, for dreams, for protection from the unnameable. They leave coins, they leave eggs. Sometimes they leave questions, wrapped in red cloth, folded tight and trembling. And in return, she gives them answers, or riddles, depending on the mood of the one who speaks through her. Still, as sacred as she is, she's also a reminder of something society likes to bury, that the gods don't care much for rules. They choose whom they please, and when they do, they don't always ask if she wanted it. That tension simmers quietly, never addressed outright, but always felt, especially when the god starts demanding more attention, more devotion, more nights spent alone. drenched in sweat, whispering names not found in any human genealogy. Because if marriage to a deity is sacred, it's also territorial. And nothing tests that devotion like divine jealousy, especially when offerings fall short or mortal desires creep too close. They say the gods are generous, and they are, but their generosity is transactional, a system of cosmic cause and effect wrapped in perfume and silence. They give, you forget, they remind. In the temple, offerings are not decorative. Every drop of gin poured, every bead laid at the altar, every plate of honeyed yam left under the moon is part of a contract. And like all sacred contracts, it's less about words and more about presence. The wife must show up, not just with her body, but with her whole trembling willingness. Sometimes the god is pleased easily, a bottle of palm wine, a ribbon tied just right. Other times he sulks, refuses to descend, sends dreams full of sand and teeth. That's when the priest intervenes, not to fix the wife, to placate the husband. Jealousy, in this realm, is divine currency. The gods don't simply want loyalty, they want obsession. They want to be the center of gravity, the pulse behind every breath. The divine husband watches her every move, not with eyes, but with weather, with luck, with illness. If her gaze strays, if her fingers touch someone else with too much warmth, the consequences are ... poetic. It starts small, a rash, a mist period, a sudden silence from the spirits. Then the dreams turn. Water becomes blood, mirrors crack, fire refuses to burn, and everyone knows what it means. She's been touched by someone else, someone mortal. The gods don't like competition. They don't argue. They retaliate. Not always with violence, sometimes with withdrawal, which, for a spiritual wife, is worse. Without the god, she's just a woman in white. No visions, no power, no dance that makes the earth hum. But when she obeys, when she offers herself with full devotion, the gifts come like rain in dry season. Visions so clear they cut, trances so deep they leave her weeping. The ability to speak someone's secret without ever learning their name. She becomes more than a woman. She becomes threshold, portal, storm. And in this way, the god keeps her, bound not by chains, but by the shimmering leash of ecstasy and fear. A leash she wears like jewelry, proudly, resignedly, with just enough defiance to stay human. Because to serve a spirit like that, one must constantly perform balance between pleasure and obligation, between power and submission, between being chosen and being consumed. But the god never stays satisfied for long. He always wants more time, more flesh, more fire in the blood. And so the rituals evolve, the demands grow, and the role, the inheritance, must be passed on before the body forgets how to carry it. Because no wife, not even a divine one, serves forever. There must be a next, a girl whose dreams already ache. It rarely skips a generation, not because the gods insist, though sometimes they do, but because the body remembers before the mind agrees. A girl watches her mother twitch in trance, hips moving to a rhythm no drumbeat follows. She sees her aunt vanish behind the altar curtain for hours, returning with eyes full of other places. She's told not to ask questions, but the questions settle in her skin anyway. Initiation doesn't always need a ceremony. Sometimes it starts with mimicry, a child dancing alone in the yard, imitating the shuffle and sway. She's seen so often it feels like muscle memory. The elders watch quietly, not amused, not afraid, just ... waiting. Because when the spirit calls, it usually sounds like a whisper wrapped in breath and sweat. And when it arrives early, it comes through dance. In Vodun temples, movement is not entertainment. It's transmission. Sacred knowledge passes not through scrolls or sermons, but through hips, knees, shoulders, the deliberate tilt of the neck, the choreography of inheritance. Every gesture maps the body to the divine. Every turn of the foot repeats a prayer once danced by someone long dead. The girl learns with her bones. She learns to shake without breaking, to fall without fear, to twist until the breath of the god fits neatly into her own. Breath, here, is the language of devotion. You don't say you're ready, you breathe it, in sync, in offering, in surrender. She learns the medicines, not from books, but from hands, bitter leaves crushed between fingers, oils warmed by thighs, the precise hum that drives illness out of a swollen belly. These women don't just serve gods, they serve women, midwives, soothsayers, healers whose diagnoses come from pulse and presence, not lab tests. And always, beneath the rituals, the thrum of erotic trance. It's not about sex. It's about voltage, about letting the divine plug directly into the body, bypassing shame, bypassing logic, about learning how to carry pleasure as a form of revelation, not guilt. When the God is pleased, he may speak through her. When he's very pleased, he may remake her. New voice, new name, new walk. She doesn't become someone else. She becomes more of what was already there, hidden behind skin and obedience. And when the time comes, she recognizes it. The ache in the chest, that's not illness. The dream that doesn't fade. The apprentice watching her with wide eyes, already swaying. That's when she knows, it's time to pass the breath. Not just the knowledge, but the rhythm, the fire, the God's own scent that lingers on the ribs. And somewhere in the corner of the temple, incense curling like a serpent, another girl is already dancing without knowing why. There's no retirement from this kind of marriage. No parchment, no pension, just a body softened by trance and a lifetime of carrying voices that don't belong to it. When the spirit grows silent, and they all do, eventually it doesn't mean absence, only a change in frequency. The wife becomes something else, not empty, just ... tuned differently. She may no longer shake when the drums start, but her presence still thickens the air. People still lower their voices around her, still leave offerings at her door, just in case. Because once a body has hosted a god, it never quite returns to civilian status. The scent of camphor clings to the bones, and the lineage, it never dies. The gods are patient. They know how to wait in the bloodline, in the dreams. In the girl who hasn't started bleeding yet, but already hums when the moon is full. That's the thing about sacred sexuality in Vodun temples. It's not a relic. It's not a myth. It's a current, unseen, but always moving. Through thighs, through chants, through generations of women who never asked to be chosen, but learned to carry fire like it was silk. Because the gods never leave quietly. They don't say goodbye. They say, dance.